December the 16th, 2022. That is the date a newspaper column went out under his name about a woman he had never met, written in language so degrading that within days it would become the single most complained about piece of journalism in the history of British press regulation. 25,100 complaints. Not from a campaign, not from a coordinated effort, from ordinary readers one at a time, until a watchdog that had never once in 9 years upheld a complaint about sexism had no choice left but to act. Because this was never just a bad column that blew over in a week. It was the moment the loudest voice in British farming media found out that some things do not get forgiven simply because the ratings stayed high. And the person who said so first, loudest, and most publicly was his own daughter. If you want to understand exactly what she said, why it mattered more than almost anything written about her father that year, and what actually happened when a national press regulator got involved, stick with this, because there are details near the end that even people who followed this story closely at the time never fully connected. 2 days. That is how long it took before Emily Clarkson, his own daughter, a podcast host with her own public platform, decided silence was not an option. She did not do it quietly. She did not do it through a lawyer or a publicist. She posted it herself on her own Instagram in her own words. On the 18th of December, 48 hours after the column ran, she wrote that her position on misogyny and the treatment of women by the media had always been clear. And then she said the part that made headlines on its own. She stood against everything her dad wrote about Meghan Markle. That is not a neutral sentence. That is a daughter, in public, using the word against about her own father, in defense of a woman he had spent an entire column attacking. Here is what nobody watching the initial pile-on fully understood in real time. Public figures apologize constantly. It is close to meaningless at this point, a professional reflex, a statement drafted by someone else and posted to make the story die faster. What is far rarer and far harder to walk back from is a family member declining to close ranks. Clarkson's own initial response, posted on Twitter within days, described the piece as a clumsy reference to a scene from a television drama and said he was horrified to have caused hurt. It was, by any measure, a fast apology. It was also, notably, not the same thing his daughter had said. He called it clumsy. She called it something she stood against. That distinction is the entire story, and almost nobody sat with it long enough to notice. Emily Clarkson was not the only public figure to say something. Comedian Bill Bailey, speaking to a newspaper days after the apology, said plainly that Clarkson had gotten the kicking he deserved. Broadcaster Carol Vorderman and comedian John Bishop were among other public figures who criticized the column publicly in the days that followed. None of them owed Clarkson anything professionally. None of them were required to comment at all. They did so anyway, and the pattern across nearly all of it was the same. This was not being treated as an opinion people disagreed with. It was being treated as something that crossed a line entirely separate from ordinary editorial disagreement. Stop here for a second, because the next part is where this stops being a story about public reaction and starts being a story about formal accountability, and that's the part most coverage at the time treated as a footnote. If you want to see exactly how this played out once the regulators got involved, and what actually happened between him and the people he wrote about, subscribing means you won't miss the part of this most coverage left out. By January the 16th, a full month after the column ran, Clarkson posted again, this time on Instagram, saying plainly that he was really sorry. He revealed something he had not said publicly before. On Christmas morning, weeks earlier, he had personally emailed Prince Harry and Meghan Markle to apologize. That should have been the closing chapter. It was not. A spokesperson for the Duke and Duchess of Sussex responded directly, stating that the email had been addressed solely to Prince Harry, never to Meghan. Not once. 2 apologies. One meant for her. One that, by his own recipient's account, never actually reached her. The failure was not the column anymore. The failure was in the apology that followed it, and somehow that detail got less coverage than the original piece. Here is where the story stops being about one bad week and becomes something with actual regulatory teeth. In February 2023, the Independent Press Standards Organization formally opened an investigation, prompted specifically by complaints from 2 organizations, the Fawcett Society Britain's leading gender equality charity, and the Wild Foundation, which supports survivors of domestic abuse, two organizations built around protecting women, taking a national newspaper's most famous columnist to the only body with the power to force a public reckoning. The complaints were specific. They alleged breaches of the code covering accuracy, harassment, and discrimination. For 4 months, nothing was resolved. The Sun defended itself. Clarkson had already apologized, twice in 2 different places. The newspaper argued the complaints were about taste and personal judgment, not regulation, and tried to place the entire matter outside IPSO's authority altogether. It did not work. On the 30th of June, 2023, IPSO ruled. The column breached Clause 12 of the Editor's Code, the clause covering discrimination. For the first time in the regulator's 9-year history, a complaint about sexism against a news organization had been upheld. Not once in 9 years had that clause been used this way before. The IPSO chair called it a serious breach of the code. The Fawcett Society's chief executive said the 2 organizations had made history. The ruling specifically found that the column implied Meghan Markle's influence came from her sexuality, rather than any personal achievement, and that the imagery used was a reference to public humiliation, aimed specifically at a woman characterized as sexually manipulative. IPSO rejected the separate complaints about accuracy and harassment. It upheld only the one about discrimination, but that one was enough. The Sun did not accept this quietly. It took the case to the Independent Complaints Reviewer, a third-party body that exists specifically to check IPSO's own decisions. It lost there too. The reviewer declined to overturn the ruling. The Sun was ordered to publish the ruling in Clarkson's own regular slot in the paper, and to flag it on the front page for 24 hours, something the paper had not been forced to do since a front page. Political Story breached regulations back in 2016. This is not a story about one columnist having a bad week. This is a story about a national institution being told, formally, on the record, after fighting the ruling and losing twice, that it had crossed a line it had never crossed in 9 years of operation. And in the middle of all of it, one detail sat quietly, mostly unremarked on outside a handful of entertainment trade reports. According to Variety, Amazon Prime Video, the platform behind his most successful show in a decade was reported to be distancing itself, with sources indicating the streamer would not commission any new programs with him going forward. That reporting came out in 2023. Clarkson's farm continued airing new seasons well past that point, and reports emerged years later of a further renewal, taking the show into 2027. Whether that reflects a change in position, a distinction between an existing hit show and new projects, or something that was simply never as absolute as the initial reporting suggested, is genuinely unclear, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. That tension between what was reported at the time and what actually happened since is real, and it remains unresolved. Here's the part almost nobody puts side by side with everything else. He is still making the show. She is still his daughter. Public figures across comedy, broadcasting, and gender equality advocacy all said, independently and without coordination, that this was different from ordinary controversy, and a regulator that had gone 9 years without ever ruling this way, ruled this way, and had that ruling checked and upheld a second time. None of those facts erases any of the others. That is the actual picture, not a tidy one. A father who apologized twice in 2 different registers to 2 different audiences, only one of which appears to have actually received it. A daughter who chose, within 48 hours, to stand publicly on the other side of the line from her own father, in defense of a woman she had never worked with and had no professional reason to defend. A regulator that had never once in 9 years found a newspaper guilty of sexism, until this exact case forced its hand and then had that decision independently checked and confirmed. A streaming platform that reportedly pulled back, and a show that kept going anyway. None of that resolves into a neat lesson. It resolves into the honest, uncomfortable shape of what actually happened, which is that public apologies and private relationships do not automatically heal on the same timeline, and sometimes they do not heal in the same direction at all. What is genuinely still unknown and worth being honest about rather than speculating on is what the relationship between Jeremy and Emily Clarkson looks like now. Years on, away from cameras and Instagram statements, public figures reconcile privately all the time without ever making that reconciliation public. And the absence of a further public statement from either of them does not tell us anything definitive either way. That uncertainty is real, and pretending otherwise would be inventing a resolution that doesn't exist. If this is the kind of story you want more of, honest rather than tidy, real rather than dramatized past the actual facts, subscribing helps this channel keep doing exactly that. I'd genuinely like to know what you think, not as a prompt for outrage, but as an actual question. Do you think a public apology to the person harmed matters more than a private one that never reaches them? Drop your answer below, and thank you, as always, for watching.